They told you to quiet your mind, to stop thinking so much, to just be present, to let it go. They sold you meditation apps and breathing techniques and mantras designed to turn down the volume of that relentless voice in your head. The one that runs scenarios at 3 in the morning. The one that replays conversations from 5 years ago, searching for hidden meanings and pauses and facial expressions. The one that builds entire universes of possibility out of a single text message that ended with a period instead of an exclamation point. And you tried. God, you tried. You downloaded the apps, you sat cross-legged on expensive cushions, you listened to people with soothing voices tell you that thoughts are just clouds passing through the sky of your consciousness. You practiced gratitude journals and positive affirmations, and all the tools designed for people whose minds work in straight lines. But your mind doesn't work in straight lines. It works in spirals and branches and infinite recursive loops that would make a quantum computer jealous. It works in dimensions that most people can't even perceive. It sees connections that don't exist yet, patterns that haven't fully formed, dangers that might materialize 3 moves from now. And they call this a problem. They called it anxiety, rumination, catastrophizing, overthinking. They gave it clinical names and pharmaceutical solutions and therapeutic frameworks, all designed around the single premise that the way your mind works is broken and needs to be fixed. But here's what nobody told you. Here's the truth they didn't have the vision to see. That magnificent, relentless, exhausting engine of thought that keeps you up at night, that's not your curse. That's your superpower. Every person who changed the world, who saw what others couldn't, who built empires from ideas and turned impossible into inevitable, they had minds like yours. Minds that couldn't stop. Minds that wouldn't settle. Minds that saw the world not as it is, but as it could be, should be, might be, will be. Da Vinci filled 60,000 pages with thoughts he couldn't stop thinking. Einstein conducted thought experiments so complex that they bent the fabric of reality itself. Marie Curie overthought radiation until she discovered elements that didn't exist in any textbook. Nikola Tesla visualized inventions in such detail that he could build them in his mind, test them, improve them, all before touching a single tool. Were they anxious? Absolutely. Were they consumed by their thoughts? Completely. Did they need to quiet their minds? They needed to do the exact opposite. They needed to amplify their overthinking, weaponize it, transform it from a liability into the most powerful competitive advantage a human being can possess. And that's exactly what you're going to learn to do. Not how to think less, how to overthink better. Not how to silence your mind, how to conduct it like a symphony. Not how to fix what's broken, how to unleash what's been caged. Because the world doesn't need more people who've learned to quiet their minds. It needs more people who've learned to trust them, to follow them down rabbit holes that lead to wonderland, to build with thoughts the way architects build with steel and glass. The world needs people who overthink like geniuses. And whether you know it yet or not, that's exactly what you are.
Chapter 1. The Magnificent Trap. You're standing in line at a coffee shop. It's a simple transaction. You've done it 1,000 times. But today, the barista said, "Enjoy your coffee." And you said, "You too." And now, 15 minutes later, sitting at your desk with that coffee growing cold beside you, you're still replaying the interaction. You're analyzing the micro-expression on their face. Was that pity? Amusement? Did they tell their coworker about it the moment you left? Are you now part of some ongoing joke about awkward customers? You know this is ridiculous. You know that barista has already forgotten you exist. You know that in the cosmic scheme of things, this interaction matters exactly 0. And yet, you can't stop thinking about it. This is the trap. Not the overthinking itself. The trap is what you've been taught to believe about the overthinking. That it's a malfunction, a glitch in your operating system, evidence of some fundamental inadequacy in how you process the world. You've been taught that healthy, normal, successful people don't do this. They don't replay conversations. They don't construct elaborate decision trees for minor choices. They don't lie awake at night following thought patterns that branch and multiply like frost on a window. They just live effortlessly, naturally, without this constant background radiation of analysis. And so you've spent years, maybe decades, trying to become that person, the person who doesn't overthink, the person whose mind is a still pond instead of a storm system, the person who experiences life directly instead of through 17 layers of interpretation and analysis. You've tried to fix yourself. But here's what actually happened every time you tried to quiet that mind of yours. You didn't become more present. You became more anxious about being anxious. You didn't find peace. You found a new thing to overthink, your overthinking. You didn't solve the problem. You created a meta-problem, a problem about having problems, a spiral that feeds on itself until you can't tell where the original thought ended and the anxiety about the thought began. This is the magnificent trap. It convinces you that the solution to thinking too much is thinking less, when actually the solution is thinking better. Let me show you what I mean. Your brain isn't malfunctioning when it replays that coffee shop interaction. It's doing exactly what an advanced pattern recognition system is designed to do. It's extracting data, learning social dynamics, building predictive models of human behavior, refining your understanding of how communication works, how embarrassment functions, how to navigate the infinite complexity of human interaction. That replay isn't rumination, it's research. Your brain is running simulations, testing variables, building a more sophisticated model of reality so that next time, and there will be thousands of next times, you'll navigate similar situations with more skill, more grace, more precision. This is what genius-level minds do. They don't experience reality once and move on. They experience it, then re-experience it, then extract every possible lesson and insight and pattern until they've transformed a single data point into a comprehensive understanding. But you've been taught to interrupt this process. You've been taught that the healthy response is to notice the thought, label it as overthinking, and redirect your attention to your breath or the present moment or some other mindfulness anchor.
And sometimes that's exactly right. But most of the time, you're interrupting a cognitive process that was about to deliver a breakthrough. Researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara discovered something remarkable about mind wandering. They found that people whose minds wander the most score higher on creativity tests, generate more novel solutions to problems, and show greater activity in brain regions associated with complex problem solving. Your wandering mind isn't distracted, it's exploring. When you replay that coffee shop conversation, somewhere around the 15th iteration, your brain isn't just spinning its wheels. It's making connections. It's linking this interaction to hundreds of previous interactions, finding patterns, building frameworks, developing what psychologists call social intelligence. But what's really something much more powerful, it's developing sight. The ability to see beneath the surface of social interactions, to read the invisible architecture of human dynamics, to predict outcomes before they unfold, to navigate complexity that most people don't even know exists. This is your gift, not in spite of your overthinking, because of it. But the gift is still wrapped in the trap, and the trap is this. You're using a genius-level processor to run anxiety-level programs. You're taking this magnificent engine of cognition and pointing it at worst-case scenarios instead of best-case possibilities, at social failures instead of social mastery, at everything that could go wrong instead of everything you could build. You're overthinking the wrong things in the wrong ways. And that's what's about to change. Because once you understand that your mind isn't broken, that it's actually operating at a level most people can't access, everything shifts.
You stop trying to quiet your mind and start conducting it. You stop seeing your thoughts as the enemy and start seeing them as the raw material of genius. You stop asking, how do I think less, and start asking, how do I think better? That question changes everything. That question is the key that unlocks the trap. And the answer is waiting in every thought you've been taught to dismiss, every spiral you've been told to interrupt, every obsessive loop you've tried to escape. The answer is already in your mind. It's been there all along. You've just been too busy trying to fix yourself to notice you were never broken.
Chapter 2. When Chaos Becomes Architecture. There's a room in your mind. Actually, there are thousands of rooms in your mind, but there's one in particular we need to visit right now. It's the room where all your unfinished thoughts live. The conversations you never completed, the decisions you haven't made, the ideas you started but never developed, the questions you asked but never answered. For most people, this room is small, manageable, a few items on a mental shelf easily ignored. For you, this room is a warehouse. It's packed floor to ceiling with half-formed thoughts, each one connected to 17 others by invisible threads of association. You walk into this room every time you try to make a decision, and instead of finding clarity, you find 1,000 new considerations you hadn't thought of yet. Should you take that job offer? Well, that depends on whether the company's growth trajectory aligns with industry trends, which depends on how AI might disrupt the sector, which depends on political outcomes that won't be determined for years, which means you can't possibly know if this decision is right, which means maybe you should wait for more information, but waiting is also a decision, and what if waiting means you miss the opportunity, but what if jumping too soon means you commit to the wrong path, and this is where most people would tell you to stop, to simplify, to trust your gut, to flip a coin if you have to, because any decision is better than no decision. They're wrong. What looks like paralysis is actually something far more sophisticated. It's your mind refusing to accept insufficient data, refusing to collapse infinite possibility into premature certainty, refusing to pretend that complex questions have simple answers. Your mind is doing exactly what a high-precision instrument does when asked to measure something with inadequate tools. It's refusing to give you a false positive. But here's where it gets interesting. That warehouse in your mind, that chaos of unfinished thoughts and unanswered questions, it's not actually chaos. It's pre-architecture. It's the phase that comes before building, when all the materials are laid out and you can still see every possibility, every configuration, every potential structure. Most people rush through this phase because it feels uncomfortable. It feels like mess, like indecision, like overthinking. But the greatest architects know something that most people don't. The mess is where the breakthroughs happen. Frank Gehry, who designed some of the most innovative buildings in the world, doesn't start with clean blueprints. He starts with chaos. He crumples paper, he builds rough models, he lets forms emerge from experimentation and what looks like disorder. His studio is famously chaotic, filled with half-finished models and sketches and ideas in various states of completion. Because he understands that creativity doesn't emerge from organization. It emerges from the collision of unrelated elements in a space where they're free to connect in unexpected ways. This is what your mind is doing in that warehouse. It's not stuck, it's synthesizing. Every time you revisit that job decision, you're not rehashing the same thoughts. You're adding new variables, new connections, new insights. You're building a more complete model of reality. You're moving toward a decision that accounts for more factors than any simple pros and cons list could capture. You're thinking in dimensions that most decision-making frameworks can't access. But there's a problem. You can't stay in the warehouse forever. At some point, pre-architecture has to become architecture. Possibility has to become form. The chaos has to resolve into structure. And this is where overthinkers get trapped.
not because they can't make decisions, but because they haven't learned how to navigate the transition from exploration to execution. They haven't learned the signals that indicate when they've gathered enough information, when the synthesis is complete, when it's time to build. They stay in the warehouse, adding one more consideration, one more scenario, one more what if forever. This is the difference between overthinking as a liability and overthinking as genius. Genius knows when to stay in chaos and when to emerge from it. Genius knows that the goal isn't to eliminate the warehouse, it's to master the art of moving through it. Researchers studying expert decision makers discovered something fascinating. Chess grandmasters, experienced firefighters, veteran emergency room doctors, all of them considered more variables than novices, not fewer. They thought about more possibilities, more outcomes, more complex scenarios. But they thought about them faster. They'd built what psychologists call chunking patterns, the ability to recognize configurations and immediately access relevant information without conscious analysis. They transformed chaos into architecture so many times that they could navigate complexity at speeds that looked like intuition. This is what you're building toward. Not a quieter mind, a faster one. Not fewer thoughts, more efficient ones. Not escape from the warehouse, mastery of it. And that mastery starts with a single recognition. The chaos isn't your enemy. The chaos is the raw material. Every unfinished thought, every unanswered question, every spiral you've ever traveled, they're all building materials. They're all part of the architecture. And the structure you're building is unlike anything you've imagined, because it's not a shelter from complexity. It's a cathedral that holds it.
Chapter 3. The Overthinking Advantage. There's a moment that happens to every overthinker. You're in a meeting, or at dinner with friends, or sitting in a strategy session at work, and someone proposes an idea, a plan, a solution to whatever problem is on the table. And everyone nods. Everyone agrees. Everyone thinks it's brilliant. Except you. Because in the 3 seconds since they finished speaking, your mind has already traveled 6 months into the future and found 17 problems they haven't considered. You've seen the second-order consequences, the hidden costs, the assumption that seems solid now but will crumble under pressure that nobody else is anticipating. You've seen the failure point. And now you have a choice. You can speak up and be the person who overthinks everything, who shoots down ideas, who can't just go with the flow. You can watch their faces shift from enthusiasm to frustration as you explain the complexity they're trying to avoid. Or you can stay quiet. Let them discover the problems on their own. Let the preventable disaster unfold. Let the consequences you clearly saw materialize exactly as you predicted, while everyone wonders how this happened, how nobody saw it coming. Except you did see it coming. You always see it coming. This feels like a curse. It feels isolating, exhausting. Like you're the only person in the room who can see the iceberg while everyone else is admiring how smooth the sailing is. But here's what you haven't recognized yet. This isn't a curse. This is pattern recognition operating at a level that most people simply don't have access to. This is your mind running simulations at a speed and depth that gives you a view of reality that others can't perceive. This is strategic foresight. And it's one of the most valuable cognitive abilities a human being can possess. Every major disaster in business, in politics, in technology, every preventable catastrophe that people look back on and ask, how did nobody see this? They all had the same thing in common. Someone saw it. Somewhere in the organization,
in the administration, in the development team, there was a person whose mind ran the simulations and identified the failure point. Someone who understood the second-order effects, who saw the complexity everyone else was flattening into false simplicity. Someone who overthought it. And they were either ignored, or they stayed quiet, or they couldn't articulate what they saw in a way that penetrated the certainty of people who were moving too fast to think deeply. The Challenger explosion. Financial analysts had identified the risk patterns that led to the 2008 financial crisis years before it happened. Engineers at Boeing raised concerns about the 737 MAX years before planes started falling from the sky. The pattern is always the same. Someone saw it, someone thought it through. Someone ran the mental simulations that revealed the hidden fragility in systems everyone else trusted. And they were dismissed as overthinkers, as pessimists, as people who couldn't see the big picture because they were too focused on details. But they weren't missing the big picture. They were seeing a bigger picture than anyone else in the room. They were seeing the picture that includes what happens after the initial success, after the launch, after the point where everyone else stops thinking. They were thinking in time. This is what your mind does naturally. While most people think in snapshots, static images of how things are or how they want them to be, you think in movies. You see how this decision leads to that outcome, which creates this new situation, which forces that response, which generates this unintended consequence. You don't just see the chessboard, you see the game.
Neuroscientists at Washington University studied the brains of people engaged in complex planning tasks. They found that individuals who considered more variables and potential outcomes showed greater activity in the prefrontal cortex and stronger connections between different brain regions. Their brains were literally building more sophisticated models of reality. But here's what the research also showed. These individuals reported higher levels of anxiety and struggled more with decision-making because they saw more clearly what was at stake. Not because they were broken, because they were operating with higher resolution information. Imagine trying to navigate a city with a map that shows not just streets, but traffic patterns, construction zones, accident probabilities, weather impacts, and historical data about which routes failed during which conditions. Is that map more useful? Absolutely. Is it more overwhelming to look at? Also, absolutely. This is the overthinker's dilemma. You have access to higher resolution information, but you haven't been taught how to process it without becoming paralyzed by it. You see the complexity, but you don't yet have frameworks for navigating it. You recognize patterns, but you can't always articulate them in ways that others understand. So your advantage gets reframed as a liability. Your depth gets criticized as indecision. Your foresight gets dismissed as pessimism. And you start to wonder if maybe everyone else is right. Maybe you should just trust your gut more, think less, analyze less, just do. But here's what happens when you do that. You make decisions faster, sure, but you make worse decisions. You move with more confidence, absolutely. But you move toward outcomes you could have avoided if you trusted what you saw. You become more like everyone else. And you lose your superpower. Because the ability to see around corners, to identify failure points before they materialize, to recognize patterns that haven't fully materialized yet, this isn't something most people can develop through training. This is how your mind naturally works. And the world desperately needs minds that work this way. Not minds that have learned to think less, minds that have learned to think better. To take that natural pattern recognition and transform it from a source of anxiety into a source of strategic advantage. This transformation doesn't happen by suppressing your overthinking. It happens by directing it, by learning to distinguish between productive simulation and unproductive rumination, between pattern recognition that serves you and spiral thinking that traps you, between strategic foresight and catastrophic fantasy.
The difference isn't in how much you think. It's in what you think about and why. When you're replaying that awkward coffee shop interaction for the 15th time, your pattern recognition system is running, but it's running on low-value data. It's using genius-level processing power to solve a problem that doesn't need solving. That's unproductive overthinking. But when you're in that meeting and your mind immediately identifies the failure point in someone's proposal, that same pattern recognition system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's saving you from predictable disasters. It's seeing complexity that needs to be addressed. It's giving you information that could change outcomes. That's strategic overthinking. And the difference between the two isn't always obvious in the moment. They feel similar, they both activate the same spiraling thought patterns, the same sense of being unable to shut your brain off, the same exhaustion of thinking in loops. But one is your mind spinning its wheels in mud. The other is your mind mapping territory that others can't see. Learning to tell them apart, that's the skill. Learning to feed your overthinking high-value problems instead of low-value anxieties, that's the art. Learning to trust what you see, even when others can't see it yet, that's the courage. And all of it starts with a simple recognition. Your ability to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously, to run mental simulations that account for variables others ignore, to see the patterns that haven't fully materialized yet, this isn't your weakness. This is the advantage you've been taught to apologize for. This is the genius you've been trying to cure. And once you stop trying to think like everyone else and start learning to think like yourself, only better, everything changes. The overwhelm doesn't disappear, but it transforms into something else, into clarity of a kind you've never experienced, into power you didn't know you had access to, into the ability to navigate complexity that would paralyze anyone else. You're not going to become someone who thinks less. You're going to become someone who thinks so well that what looks like overthinking to everyone else looks like mastery to you. And it starts now.
Chapter 4. Patterns that see in the dark. Your friend is telling you a story. It's a simple story, really, about a new relationship they're excited about how different this person is from anyone they've dated before, about how easy it feels, how natural, how this might actually be the one. And you're listening, you're nodding, you're making the appropriate encouraging sounds. But underneath all of that, your mind is running a different program entirely, because you've heard this story before. Not this exact story, not these exact details, but the pattern, the structure, the shape of what's happening beneath what's being said. You're noticing that your friend describes this new person in exactly the same terms they used for the last relationship and the one before that. Different names, different faces, same fundamental dynamic. You're noticing the things they're not saying, the questions they're not asking, the warning signs they're interpreting as exciting unpredictability instead of concerning instability. You're seeing 3 months into the future, to the conversation where they're going to call you crying, confused about how this happened again, how they didn't see it coming. And you have to decide whether to say something or stay quiet, whether to trust what you see or dismiss it as your overthinking mind creating problems that don't exist yet. This moment happens to overthinkers constantly. This moment of seeing patterns that others don't see, of recognizing trajectories that haven't fully unfolded, of knowing how the story ends while everyone else is still excited about the beginning. And it's lonely, because you can't always explain how you know what you know. You can't point to concrete evidence. You can't construct an airtight logical argument for why you're certain that this thing that looks fine right now is going to become a problem later. You just see it. The pattern recognition happens so fast, so automatically, that by the time you're consciously aware of your conclusion, you've already lost track of the reasoning that got you there. This is what psychologists call thin slicing.
the ability to make accurate judgments based on narrow windows of experience. Malcolm Gladwell wrote an entire book about how expert intuition can outperform detailed analysis in certain domains. But he left out the part about how isolating it feels, how difficult it is to trust yourself when you can't explain yourself, how often you're right in ways you can't prove until it's too late for the proof to matter. The truth is, your pattern recognition isn't mystical. It's not magic. It's not some supernatural intuition. It's database matching operating at unconscious speed. Every experience you've ever had, every story you've ever heard, every observation you've ever made, they're all cataloged in your mind. Not as discrete memories that you consciously access, but as patterns, as templates, as frameworks for understanding how things work. When your friend tells you about their new relationship, your mind isn't just hearing that story. It's simultaneously accessing every similar story it's ever encountered and running a pattern-matching algorithm.
Does this match the pattern of relationships that succeed? Or does it match the pattern of relationships that fail? Your conscious mind receives the answer before it can track the calculation, and that answer feels like intuition, but it's actually something more powerful. It's pattern recognition refined by years of observation, operating at a speed that bypasses conscious analysis. This is your second superpower. The first was strategic foresight, the ability to run simulations and identify failure points. This one is different. This is the ability to recognize configurations before they're complete, to see the shape of something when only a few pieces are visible, to know how the pattern continues before the pattern has finished forming. This is the cognitive ability that allowed ancient humans to identify predators from partial information, to recognize poisonous plants from subtle visual cues, to read weather patterns in the behavior of animals and the smell of the air. Pattern recognition is survival technology, and your mind does it at a level that most people's don't. But here's where it gets complicated. Pattern recognition, like any powerful tool, can be used in ways that serve you or ways that sabotage you. The same pattern matching system that helps you identify genuine red flags in your friend's relationship is also the system that makes you see threats that don't exist. The same ability that lets you predict project failures from early warning signs is the ability that makes you catastrophize about situations that might never materialize. The same gift that gives you clarity about complex situations is the curse that makes you see patterns in randomness, meaning in noise, threats in ambiguity. You're using the same system. You just haven't learned to calibrate it yet. Researchers studying expert pattern recognition found something crucial. Experts aren't just better at seeing patterns. They're better at distinguishing signal from noise. They're better at knowing which patterns matter and which patterns are just random variation that looks meaningful but isn't.
A novice chess player sees threats everywhere. Every move by their opponent looks dangerous because they can't yet distinguish between moves that actually threaten their position and moves that only seem threatening. A grandmaster sees the same board and immediately knows which threats are real and which are illusions. Same pattern recognition ability, different calibration. This is what you're developing, not the ability to recognize patterns. You already have that. The ability to know which patterns to trust. And that's harder than it sounds, because your mind doesn't just recognize patterns in external situations, it recognizes patterns in your own thought processes. It builds meta patterns, patterns about patterns, recursive loops of pattern recognition that can trap you in spirals of overthinking. You recognize the pattern of anxiety, which triggers anxiety about the anxiety. You recognize the pattern of catastrophizing, which makes you catastrophize about your tendency to catastrophize. You recognize the pattern of overthinking, which makes you overthink your overthinking. This is the dark side of pattern recognition. It can turn inward. It can become self-referential. It can create problems by recognizing problems, generating the very thing it's trying to identify. And this is where most overthinking advice goes wrong. It tells you to interrupt the pattern, to notice the spiral and redirect your attention, to label the thought as just anxiety and dismiss it. Sometimes that's right, but sometimes, often, you're interrupting a pattern recognition process that was about to deliver genuine insight. You're shutting down your early warning system just as it was about to tell you something you need to know. The question isn't whether to trust your pattern recognition. The question is how to distinguish between patterns that are showing you something real about the external world and patterns that are showing you something about your internal state, between signal and noise, between insight and anxiety, between clarity and confusion. And the answer isn't simple, because anxiety can be insight, your nervous system recognizing a genuine threat and trying to get your attention. And what feels like clarity can sometimes be a pattern you're imposing on randomness because your mind can't tolerate uncertainty. This is the territory you're learning to navigate, not the clean, simple world of trust your gut or ignore your thoughts, the complex, nuanced reality where your pattern recognition is simultaneously your greatest asset and your greatest vulnerability, where the line between genius and anxiety is thin enough that you can't always tell which side you're on. But here's what changes when you stop trying to simplify this complexity and start learning to navigate it. You begin to develop what we might call meta pattern recognition, the ability to recognize patterns in how you recognize patterns, the ability to notice when your mind is tracking something real versus when it's tracking something recursive, the ability to feel the difference between anxiety that's pointing you toward genuine danger and anxiety that's feeding on itself. This doesn't come from thinking less, it comes from thinking with more precision, from developing the ability to observe your own cognitive processes with the same pattern recognition skills you use to observe everything else, from learning to see yourself seeing. And when you develop that ability, something remarkable happens. You don't lose your pattern recognition, you refine it. You don't stop seeing what others can't see. You start seeing it more clearly. You don't become less sensitive to patterns. You become more selective about which patterns deserve your attention. This is mastery, not the elimination of your natural abilities, the elevation of them. And it starts with a simple practice. The next time you find yourself certain about something you can't fully explain, certain that your friend's relationship won't work, certain that a project will fail, certain that a situation is heading toward disaster, pause. Not to dismiss what you're seeing, to examine it. Ask yourself, what pattern am I recognizing? Where have I seen this configuration before? What are the elements that match? What are the elements that don't? Am I seeing something about this situation, or am I seeing something about myself? These questions don't shut down your pattern recognition. They illuminate it. They bring your unconscious processing into conscious awareness so you can evaluate it, refine it, trust it when it deserves trust, and adjust it when it doesn't. This is how you transform pattern recognition from something that happens to you into something you actively direct, from a source of anxiety into a source of power, from seeing in the dark into seeing with light. And once you learn to do this, the world changes. Not because you've quieted your mind, because you've learned to read it.
Chapter 5. The Violence of Certainty. You're scrolling through social media and you see it. Another post from someone who's figured it all out. Someone who speaks in absolutes and definitive statements and unshakable confidence about how the world works, what you should do, who you should be. Just do this, never do that. The secret is, the truth is. No nuance, no caveats, no acknowledgement of complexity or context or the 1,000 variables that might make their advice completely wrong for your situation. Just certainty. Clean, simple, confident certainty. And you feel something twist in your chest. Because you can't speak like that. You can't think like that. Every time you try to make a definitive statement about anything, your mind immediately generates 17 counterexamples and edge cases in situations where the opposite might be true. You see the complexity they're flattening. You see the nuance they're erasing. You see the violence they're doing to reality by forcing it into neat, quotable, shareable certainties. And you wonder if maybe you're the problem. Maybe if you were healthier, more confident, more together, you could speak with that kind of conviction too.
Maybe you'd stop qualifying every statement, stop seeing both sides of every argument, stop undermining your own certainty with all the ways you might be wrong. Maybe you'd finally achieve the clarity that seems to come so easily to everyone else. But here's what you haven't considered. What if their certainty isn't clarity? What if it's just the willingness to ignore complexity? What if the confidence you envy is built on the foundation of not thinking deeply enough to see how complicated things actually are? There's a cognitive bias that psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect. It describes how people with limited knowledge in a domain tend to overestimate their expertise, while people with deep knowledge tend to be acutely aware of how much they don't know. The more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. The more deeply you think, the more clearly you see the limits of what anyone can be certain about. The more sophisticated your model of reality becomes, the more visible the gaps and uncertainties become. This is why experts use more hedging language than novices. It's not because they're less confident. It's because they're more accurate. They've done the work of exploring the territory. They've encountered the edge cases and exceptions and contexts where the simple rules break down. They've built complex enough models to see where the models themselves become uncertain. They've earned their uncertainty, and you've earned yours. Every qualification you add to a statement, every "it depends" you offer when someone wants a simple answer, every time you refuse to collapse complexity into false certainty, that's not weakness. That's intellectual integrity. That's your mind refusing to do violence to reality by pretending it's simpler than it is. But we live in a world that rewards certainty. Social media algorithms amplify confident statements, not nuanced ones. Marketing copy that promises definitive solutions outperforms copy that acknowledges complexity. Leaders who project unwavering conviction inspire more followers than leaders who admit uncertainty. Certainty sells. Nuance doesn't. So you're constantly bombarded with messages that tell you to simplify, to choose a side, to stop overthinking and just commit to a position. And every time you can't do that, every time your mind insists on seeing the complexity, you feel like you're failing some basic test of mental health. But you're not failing. You're resisting. You're resisting the violence of certainty. And that resistance is costing you something.
It's costing you the comfort of simple answers, the ease of tribal belonging, the social rewards that come from confidently declaring which side you're on and what you believe without caveat or qualification. It's isolating because complexity doesn't build tribes the way certainty does. Nuance doesn't create the emotional bonds that form around shared convictions. It's complicated doesn't rally people the way "here's the truth" does. But here's what you gain. You gain accuracy. You gain the ability to navigate reality as it actually is, not as you wish it were or as it's easy to believe it is. You gain the flexibility to update your beliefs when new evidence emerges instead of defending positions you fused with your identity. You gain freedom from the prison of ideological certainty that keeps people trapped in frameworks that stopped serving them years ago, but that they can't abandon, because abandoning them would mean admitting they were wrong. You remain fluid in a world that demands you solidify. And that fluidity is power. It's the power to adapt, to learn, to change, to see what's actually happening instead of what you've decided must be happening based on your predetermined certainties. But it doesn't feel like power. It feels like weakness. Because the world doesn't celebrate doubt. It celebrates conviction. It celebrates people who know exactly what they think and never waver and never second guess and never admit they might be wrong. It celebrates the appearance of strength over the reality of wisdom. And so you've been trained to see your uncertainty as a flaw, as evidence that you lack conviction, backbone, clarity of purpose.
as something to overcome rather than something to cultivate. But the greatest thinkers, the ones who actually moved human knowledge forward, rather than just speaking loudly about it, lived in uncertainty. Darwin spent decades refining his theory because he knew how easy it is to be wrong, how important it is to examine every possible counterargument before declaring something true. Einstein questioned his own groundbreaking theories, looked for their limits, acknowledged where they broke down. Marie Curie maintained scientific skepticism even about her own discoveries, subjecting them to the same rigorous doubt she applied to everyone else's work. They didn't achieve greatness by becoming certain. They achieved greatness by becoming comfortable with uncertainty while still moving forward. This is the difference between productive doubt and paralyzing doubt. Paralyzing doubt is the kind that stops you from acting, that demands perfect information before any decision, that uses uncertainty as an excuse for inaction. Productive doubt is the kind that makes your actions more effective, that refines your thinking, that keeps you from rushing into errors that confidence would blind you to. Productive doubt asks, what am I not seeing? Where might I be wrong? What evidence would change my mind? Paralyzing doubt asks, how can I be sure? What if I'm wrong? What if there's something I haven't considered? They sound similar, but one is moving toward better understanding. The other is hiding from imperfect understanding. One uses uncertainty as a tool. The other uses it as a weapon against yourself. And learning to tell the difference, that's the work. Because your mind is capable of both. Your pattern recognition can identify genuine gaps in your understanding that need to be addressed before you act, or it can manufacture gaps that don't meaningfully exist, creating uncertainty about situations that actually are clear enough to navigate. Your strategic foresight can help you anticipate real risks that deserve consideration, or it can conjure imaginary risks that serve only to justify avoidance.
Your intellectual integrity can prevent you from accepting false certainties, or it can become an excuse for never committing to anything. The same cognitive abilities, used in different ways, toward different ends. And the only way to navigate this is to develop what we might call calibrated uncertainty, the ability to know how uncertain you should be about any given thing. Some questions genuinely don't have clear answers. Some situations genuinely are too complex to reduce to simple choices. Some decisions genuinely do require more information before acting, but some don't. Some things are clear enough to act on, even if they're not perfectly certain. Some decisions can be made with 80% information, even if you could theoretically gather 90%. Some beliefs can be held confidently, even if you acknowledge they're provisional and subject to revision. The skill is knowing which is which, knowing when your uncertainty is protecting you from error and when it's protecting you from growth. Knowing when I need to think about this more means you genuinely need more data, and when it means you're avoiding a decision you're afraid to make. Knowing when your mind's demand for more certainty is serving your clarity and when it's serving your fear. This calibration doesn't come from thinking less. It comes from thinking more precisely. From learning to observe not just what you're uncertain about, but why you're uncertain about it. Is the uncertainty coming from genuine gaps in your knowledge, or from the inherent unknowability of the future? Or from anxiety that's disguising itself as intellectual rigor? Each type of uncertainty requires a different response. Genuine knowledge gaps can be filled with research, with expertise, with gathering more information. Future unknowability can't be eliminated. It can only be acknowledged and planned around. Anxiety-driven uncertainty can't be resolved with more thinking. It needs to be recognized as anxiety and addressed as such. But if you don't distinguish between them, you will apply the wrong solution.
You'll try to research your way out of anxiety. You'll try to eliminate uncertainty that's fundamentally uneliminable. You'll gather more and more information about things that don't require more information, and you'll stay stuck. Not because you can't make decisions, but because you're trying to achieve a level of certainty that would require you to violate your own intellectual integrity. And you won't do that, even when it would be easier, even when it would be more comfortable, even when everyone around you seems perfectly capable of doing it. You won't flatten complexity into false simplicity. You won't trade accuracy for comfort. You won't commit violence against reality just to feel certain. And that refusal, that stubborn, exhausting, isolating refusal to pretend you know things you don't know, that's not your weakness. That's your spine. That's the thing that will keep you from following charismatic certainty off a cliff. That's the thing that will make you right about things that everyone else is confidently wrong about. That's the thing that will let you see what's actually happening when everyone else is seeing what they've decided must be happening. But it will never feel comfortable. Certainty is comfortable. Complexity is not. Conviction is comfortable. Nuance is not. Knowing exactly what you think is comfortable. Holding multiple possibilities simultaneously is not. And you're never going to be the person who finds this easy. You're only going to be the person who gets better at doing it, who learns to carry uncertainty without being crushed by it, who learns to act decisively despite incomplete information, who learns to speak with conviction about the things that genuinely warrant it while maintaining appropriate doubt about the things that don't, who learns to navigate the space between reckless certainty and paralyzing uncertainty. That's the territory you're mapping. That's the skill you're building. And it starts with forgiving yourself for not being able to think like people who haven't thought as deeply as you have. It starts with recognizing that your uncertainty isn't a bug, it's a feature. And the world needs it more than you know.
Chapter 6. Building cathedrals in your mind. It's 2 a.m. You should be sleeping. You know you should be sleeping. Tomorrow is important. You need rest. You need to shut your brain off and drift into unconsciousness like a normal person who doesn't lie awake thinking about things that don't need to be thought about at 2 a.m. But you're not thinking about nothing. You're building something. In your mind, there's a structure taking shape. Maybe it's a solution to a problem you've been turning over for weeks. Maybe it's a creative project you're planning. Maybe it's an idea that started small and has been growing, branching, developing complexity and dimension and depth. Whatever it is, you can see it. Not visually, necessarily. Not like a picture, but you can sense its architecture. You can feel the way the pieces connect. You can follow the corridors of logic, test the load-bearing assumptions, identify where the structure is solid and where it still needs support. You're building a cathedral in your mind, and you can't stop. Not because you're compulsive or dysfunctional or unable to control your thoughts, but because when you're in the middle of building something complex and beautiful and true, walking away from it feels impossible. This is the part of overthinking that nobody talks about. The part that isn't about anxiety or rumination or catastrophizing. The part that's about creation. About using your mind the way a master architect uses a drafting table. The way a composer uses a piano. The way a programmer uses code. You're constructing something that doesn't exist yet. Something that only exists in the space between your thoughts. Something that's too complex to explain to anyone else because it hasn't been translated from the language of your mind into the language of words. And you're not going to sleep until you've figured out how the next piece fits. This is the third dimension of overthinking. We've talked about pattern recognition and strategic foresight. This is different. This is synthesis. The ability to take disparate elements
and combine them into something new. To build complex structures of thought that integrate multiple frameworks, multiple perspectives, multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. This is where genius actually happens. Not in flashes of inspiration that arrive fully formed, but in the patient, obsessive, exhausting work of building thought structures complex enough to hold truth. Einstein didn't discover relativity in a moment of insight. He built it. Over years, in his mind, constructing thought experiments so elaborate and precise that they could bend the fundamental assumptions of physics. He imagined himself riding on a beam of light. He imagined what time would look like from that perspective. He built the mathematics that could describe what he was seeing in his mind. He tested the structure from every angle, looking for the place where it would collapse, where the logic would break down. And when he couldn't find that place, when the structure held no matter how much pressure he applied, he knew he discovered something real. This is what your mind does at 2 a.m. It builds, it tests, it refines, and it won't let you rest until the structure is sound. But here's where it gets complicated. Because most people can't see what you're building. They see you lying awake at 2 a.m. and they see insomnia. They see dysfunction. They see someone who can't shut their brain off. They don't see the cathedral. They don't understand that what's happening in your mind isn't random, isn't chaotic, isn't the mental equivalent of pacing in circles. It's construction. And construction is messy. It's iterative. It's full of false starts and structural problems and pieces that don't fit until you figure out how to reshape them. It looks like obsession from the outside. From the inside, it's craftsmanship. But you can't always tell the difference. You can't always distinguish between productive building and compulsive rebuilding, between refining something that needs refinement and perfectionism that will never be satisfied, between constructing something meaningful and just avoiding sleep because sleep means stopping, and stopping means facing whatever you're avoiding. This is the razor's edge. Building mental cathedrals is one of the most valuable things a mind can do. It's how breakthroughs happen. It's how complex problems get solved. It's how new ideas emerge from the combination of old ones. But it can also become a trap. A beautiful, intricate, infinitely elaborated trap where you're always building but never finishing. Always refining but never releasing. Always thinking but never doing. The difference is output. Cathedrals, eventually, have to be built in the world. The structures you're creating in your mind, they're not complete until they've been translated into something others can experience. Into words, into art, into solutions, into actions, into reality. This is the overthinker's ultimate test. Not whether you can build complexity in your mind, but whether you can translate it into simplicity in the world. Whether you can take the cathedral and turn it into a blueprint. Whether you can take the hours of 2 a.m. thinking and distill them into something someone else can understand and use. This is terrifying, because translation always involves loss. The thing you're building in your mind has nuance and depth and dimension that can't fully survive the journey into language, into action, into reality. The moment you try to explain it, you lose fidelity. The moment you try to build it, you discover all the things you didn't account for. The moment you release it into the world, it becomes imperfect. And your mind knows this, which is why it wants to keep building, keep refining, keep perfecting the structure before you have to subject it to the corruption of reality. But the world doesn't need perfect things. It needs useful things. It needs the 70% version of your cathedral more than it needs the 100% version that will never be built.
It needs you to be willing to create things that are incomplete, imperfect, partial representations of the full complexity you can see. And this requires a different kind of courage than any we've talked about so far. It requires the courage to be misunderstood. Because when you translate complexity into simplicity, people will think the simplicity is all there is. They won't see the cathedral you built in your mind, they'll see the blueprint you drew, and they'll judge it as if the blueprint is the building. They'll critique it for missing nuance that you deliberately excluded because including it would make the blueprint unusable. They'll misinterpret it in ways that would be impossible if they could see the full structure. They'll simplify it even further until it barely resembles what you created. And you have to let them, because the alternative is keeping everything in your mind where it's perfect and complete and completely useless to anyone else. This is the price of translation. This is what it costs to take your internal cathedrals and make them external. And it's worth it. Not because the world will understand the full depth of what you've created. It won't. But because even partial translation is better than perfect silence. Even the blueprint can help someone build something they couldn't have built without it. Even the simplified version contains enough truth to be valuable. And sometimes, you'll find someone who sees the cathedral through the blueprint. Someone whose mind works like yours, who can read between the lines and reconstruct the complexity from the condensed version, who recognizes that what you've made simple was once complex and knows to look for the depth beneath the surface. Those people are rare, but they exist. And finding them makes every misunderstanding worthwhile. But first, you have to stop building in secret. You have to stop treating your mind like a private workshop where you perfect things forever. You have to start treating it like a factory that produces things for export, even when they're not finished, even when they're not perfect, even when translating them means losing something essential. You have to get comfortable with the gap between what you built in your mind and what you can build in the world. And that gap is where the magic happens. That gap is where you learn which parts of your mental structures are essential and which parts are ornamental. That gap is where you discover that sometimes the simplified version is actually better than the complex one, because it's usable in ways the complex one never could be. That gap is where you stop being someone who thinks and start being someone who thinks and builds. And the world doesn't need more thinkers. It needs more builders. It needs people who can do both, who can construct cathedrals in their minds and translate them into foundations others can build on, who can think in complexity and communicate in clarity, who can hold the full architecture in their head while drawing the blueprint with their hands. That's you. Not yet, maybe, but soon. As soon as you're willing to make something imperfect, as soon as you're willing to release something incomplete, as soon as you're willing to translate the cathedral into something smaller and simpler and less than what you imagined, but infinitely more than nothing. The world is waiting, not for your perfect thoughts, for your imperfect creations. And it's 2 a.m, and you're building. And that's exactly right. But tomorrow you translate. Tomorrow, you take what you've built and you make it real. Not perfect, real. And that makes all the difference.
Love what you're hearing? Hit that subscribe button and join our community of audiobook lovers. Your support helps us bring you more amazing stories.
There's a thought you keep having. It's not a particularly important thought. Maybe it's about something you said 3 years ago at a party, something that came out wrong, something that probably nobody else even remembers. But you remember, and you think about it. And then you think about the fact that you're thinking about it, and then you think about the fact that you're thinking about it, and suddenly you're not thinking about the original thing anymore. You're thinking about your thinking. You're analyzing your analysis. You're watching yourself watch yourself. You've gone recursive. This is the thing that makes overthinkers feel crazy.
Not the thinking itself, the thinking about the thinking, the infinite regress of self-observation that turns every thought into an object of examination, every feeling into something to be analyzed, every moment of experience into something to be understood rather than simply lived. You can't just be anxious, you have to be anxious about being anxious. You can't just make a mistake, you have to analyze why you made the mistake, what it reveals about your character, whether you're the kind of person who makes that kind of mistake, what it means that you're still thinking about it. You can't just have an experience, you have to have an experience of having an experience. And it's exhausting. It's like living your life on a stage while simultaneously sitting in the audience critiquing your performance, while also being the director taking notes, while also being the critic writing the review. You're never just in the moment. You're always one level above it, watching it happen, aware of yourself being aware. And everyone tells you this is the problem, that you need to get out of your head, that you need to stop thinking about thinking and just be, that you need presence, mindfulness, the ability to experience life directly instead of through 17 layers of metacognitive analysis. And they're not completely wrong, but they're not completely right either. Because what looks like a bug in your cognitive operating system is actually one of its most advanced features. The ability to think recursively, to apply thinking to itself, is what separates human consciousness from almost every other form of intelligence on the planet. It's what allows you to learn from your learning, to strategize about your strategies, to think about how you think, and use that understanding to think better. It's metacognition, and it's the foundation of every form of advanced intelligence. Without recursion, there's no self-improvement, no ability to identify your own cognitive biases and correct for them, no capacity to recognize that your current way of thinking about something might be limiting you and deliberately shift to a different framework. Without recursion, you're stuck with whatever mental patterns you happen to have, unable to examine them, unable to modify them, unable to evolve. With recursion, you can reprogram yourself. You can notice that you always catastrophize in certain situations and deliberately interrupt that pattern. You can recognize that you're using the wrong framework to understand a problem and switch to a better one. You can observe your own emotional reactions and choose whether to act on them or let them pass. You can think about how you think and make yourself think better. This is massive. This is the cognitive ability that makes transformation possible. But it comes with a cost, because recursion doesn't have a natural stopping point. You can think about your thinking, then think about your thinking about your thinking, then think about your thinking about your thinking about your thinking, infinitely.
Each level of recursion is valid. Each level provides information. Each level reveals something about how your mind works. But at some point, you're not getting new information anymore. You're just spiraling. You're caught in what computer scientists call infinite recursion, when a function calls itself without ever reaching a base case that would allow it to stop. In programming, infinite recursion crashes the system. In human minds, it creates the sensation of being trapped in your own head, unable to escape the endless loop of self-observation and self-analysis. This is where the gift becomes a curse, where the ability that makes you capable of profound self-understanding becomes the thing that prevents you from ever just being. And learning to navigate this, learning to use recursion without being trapped by it, that's one of the most important skills an overthinker can develop. It starts with understanding what recursion is actually for. Recursion is a tool for gaining perspective. When you step back from a thought and think about the thought, you're gaining a higher level view. You're seeing patterns you couldn't see when you were inside the thought itself. This is valuable when it reveals something new. It's not valuable when you keep seeing the same thing from slightly different angles. The difference is information gain. The first time you think about your anxiety, you might realize that you're anxious. That's new information. The second time, you might realize that your anxiety follows a particular pattern, that it shows up in certain situations but not others. That's new information. The third time, you might realize that the pattern connects to something from your past, some learned response that's no longer serving you. That's new information. But the 15th time, the 30th time, when you're thinking about your anxiety, you're not gaining new information anymore. You're just running the same loop at higher and higher levels of abstraction. This is the key distinction. Productive recursion generates new insights. Unproductive recursion generates new layers of the same insight. And your mind can't always tell the difference, because each level of recursion feels meaningful. It feels like you're getting somewhere, like you're digging deeper, like you're about to discover something important. But sometimes you're not digging deeper, you're digging sideways. You're creating the illusion of progress by adding complexity that doesn't add understanding. So how do you know which is which? There's a simple test. Ask yourself, what would change if I knew the answer to this question? If you're thinking about why you're anxious, the answer might lead you to address the source of the anxiety. That's productive. If you're thinking about why you're thinking about why you're anxious, the answer might help you understand your cognitive patterns and interrupt them. That's productive. But if you're thinking about why you're thinking about why you're thinking about why you're anxious, what would change if you figured it out? Probably nothing. Because at that level, you're not solving a problem anymore. You're avoiding feeling the anxiety by analyzing it to death. And this is where recursion becomes defense mechanism instead of insight engine. Where going meta becomes a way of not being present with what you're actually experiencing. Where thinking about your experience becomes a substitute for having your experience. Researchers studying rumination found that people who engage in abstract, analytical thinking about their emotions actually feel worse than people who think about their emotions in concrete, specific terms. Asking, why do I feel this way, leads to rumination. Asking, what exactly am I feeling right now, leads to awareness. The difference is whether you're using recursion to understand or to avoid. Whether you're stepping back to gain perspective or stepping back to create distance. Whether you're going meta to see more clearly or going meta to avoid seeing at all. And the honest answer is, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes the same recursive thought process can be both, can start as genuine inquiry and drift into avoidance without you noticing the transition. This is where the skill comes in. The skill of noticing when you've gone recursive, of recognizing that you're thinking about thinking about thinking, of asking whether this level of analysis is serving you or just creating the comfortable illusion of productivity. And this is the hard part, choosing to stop. Not because recursion is bad, but because this particular recursion, at this particular level, isn't yielding new information. You're not shutting down your metacognition. You're just bringing this iteration of it to a close and returning to the base case. In programming, every recursive function needs a base case, a condition under which it stops calling itself and returns a value. In human thinking, the base case is experience itself. Direct, unmediated experience. Not experience thought about, just experienced. This is where the recursion has to terminate if it's going to be useful. You can go up as many levels as you want. You can think about thinking about thinking about thinking. But eventually, you have to come back down. You have to return to the actual feeling, the actual situation, the actual moment.
Not to analyze it, just to be in it. And for an overthinker, this is almost impossible. Because being in the moment without analyzing it feels like not thinking. It feels like you're wasting your cognitive abilities. It feels like you're choosing to be less aware instead of more aware. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that you're choosing direct awareness over recursive awareness. You're choosing to experience the thing instead of experiencing your experience of experiencing the thing. And that's not less sophisticated. That's the completion of the recursive cycle. You went up, you gained perspective, you understood the pattern. Now you're coming back down, bringing that understanding with you and applying it by being present instead of analyzing presence. This is mastery, not the elimination of recursion, the skillful use of it, going recursive when it serves you, terminating the recursion when it doesn't, using your ability to think about thinking to understand yourself more deeply, then using that understanding to think less and experience more. And this creates a paradox that only overthinkers can truly appreciate. The more sophisticated your metacognition becomes, the more you're able to choose not to use it. The better you get at thinking about thinking, the more you're able to just think. The more advanced your recursion skills, the more you're able to return to the base case and simply be. Not because you've transcended thinking, because you've mastered it so thoroughly that you know when to deploy it and when to set it aside. This is freedom, not from your mind, but within it. The freedom to go as deep into recursion as you want, knowing you can always find your way back. The freedom to analyze your analysis, knowing you can stop whenever the analysis stops yielding insight. The freedom to think about thinking, and then, when you're ready, to just think. Or to not think at all, and be perfectly comfortable either way. Because you're not trapped in the recursion anymore. You're using it. And that makes all the difference. The gift isn't the ability to go recursive. You've always had that. The gift is the ability to choose when to stop. Chapter 8. Speed is the enemy of depth. You're in a meeting, and someone asks a question. It's a good question, an important question, the kind that deserves a thoughtful answer. And you know you have a thoughtful answer. You can feel it forming in your mind, taking shape, gathering the necessary nuance and context and qualifications that would make it accurate. But before you can speak, someone else answers, quickly, confidently, with a simplicity that sounds authoritative, even though you can immediately see the 3 ways their answer is incomplete and the 2 ways it's actually wrong. And everyone nods, because the fast answer sounded like the right answer, and your slow answer never got a chance to be heard. This happens to you constantly. In meetings and conversations, in moments when there's a pause and you're still thinking, and someone else jumps in with something quick and quotable and confidently wrong. And you've learned something from this pattern. You've learned that speed wins, that the person who speaks first gets heard, that hesitation gets interpreted as uncertainty, that taking time to think gets read as not knowing. So you've tried to get faster. You've tried to form opinions more quickly, to speak up sooner, to have the confident answer ready before anyone else can fill the silence. And it feels like dying. Because speed requires you to sacrifice exactly what makes your thinking valuable. It requires you to skip the depth, ignore the nuance, flatten the complexity, and deliver the kind of oversimplified certainty that your mind knows is incomplete. It requires you to think like everyone else. And you can do it. You can train yourself to be faster, to have quick takes and hot opinions and confident assertions that you deliver before the doubt can creep in. But every time you do it, you feel something shrink inside you. Because you're betraying your own intelligence. You're choosing speed over accuracy, performance over truth, social reward over intellectual integrity. And it works. People respond better to your quick answers than to your slow ones. You get more nods, more agreements, more social validation when you speak confidently and simply than when you speak carefully and complexly. The world rewards speed, but speed is the enemy of depth.
And depth is where your genius lives. This is the core tension of being an overthinker in a world that values rapid response. Every system of communication we've built in the modern world is optimized for speed, not depth. Social media rewards the first comment, not the most thoughtful one. News cycles reward the instant hot take, not the considered analysis that comes 3 days later. Meetings reward the person who speaks up quickly, not the person who's still thinking. Even conversations have an expected rhythm, a pace at which exchanges happen, and if you take too long to respond, the conversation moves on without you. The entire infrastructure of communication is designed for people whose thoughts form quickly and simply. It's not designed for people who need time to think well. And so you're constantly faced with a choice. Think fast and be heard. Or think well and be ignored. Neither option is acceptable. But those aren't actually the only options. There's a third path, but it requires you to completely reframe how you think about speed and depth. It requires you to stop trying to compete on speed and start competing on a different axis entirely. Here's what most people don't understand about depth. Depth isn't slow because it's inefficient. Depth is slow because it's comprehensive. When you take time to think before speaking, you're not struggling to come up with an answer. You're considering multiple answers, evaluating them against different criteria, accounting for context and exceptions and implications.
You're doing more cognitive work than the person who speaks immediately, not less. And that work has value that immediate responses can never provide. But you have to learn to communicate that value. You have to learn to make depth visible in a way that speed-oriented systems can recognize. This doesn't mean dumbing down your thinking. It means structuring your communication differently. When someone asks a question and you need time to answer it well, you don't just go silent while you think, you narrate what you're thinking about. That's a complex question. I'm thinking about how this would play out in different scenarios. Give me a moment. This does something crucial. It signals that your pause isn't uncertainty, it's processing. It makes your depth visible instead of invisible. It claims the time you need without appearing to hesitate. When you do answer, you don't apologize for the complexity, you frame it as value. Here's what makes this complicated, and then you explain the nuance, the trade-offs, the context-dependent nature of the answer. You're not slowing down the conversation, you're deepening it. And some people won't appreciate this. Some people want the fast answer, the simple solution, the confident assertion that doesn't require them to think. But those aren't your people. Your people are the ones who recognize depth when they see it, who understand that the person who takes time to think well is offering something more valuable than the person who speaks first. Your people are the ones who'd rather be right than be fast. And they exist. They're rarer than the people who value speed, but they're the ones who matter. They're the ones building things that last instead of things that trend. They're the ones solving problems that matter instead of problems that are easy. They're the ones who will recognize your depth as the advantage it is instead of the liability you've been taught to see it as. But finding them requires you to stop apologizing for thinking slowly. It requires you to stop trying to be someone you're not. It requires you to trust that your slow, deep, complex thinking is more valuable than their fast, shallow, simple thinking. Even when the world rewards them and not you. Even when they get the meeting room nods and the social media likes and the appearance of authority. Even when it feels like you're losing because you're not playing the same game. You're not losing. You're playing a different game entirely. They're playing speed chess. You're playing regular chess. And yes, they finish first. But you win. Not always in the moment. Not always in ways that are immediately visible. But 3 months later, when their quick solution has failed and created new problems,
your careful analysis will be proven right. 6 months later, when the situation turns out to be more complex than anyone initially thought, people will remember that you saw that complexity from the beginning. A year later, when they're trying to understand what went wrong, they'll wish they'd listened to the person who thought deeply instead of the person who spoke quickly. This is the long game, and it requires patience that most people don't have. It requires you to be comfortable being right in ways that won't be validated until later. It requires you to value your own judgment more than immediate social approval. It requires you to believe that depth matters even when speed is winning. And that's hard, because humans are social creatures. We're wired to seek approval, to want to be heard, to feel valued by the group. And when the group rewards speed and you're offering depth, you feel the rejection viscerally. You feel like you're doing something wrong, but you're not. You're doing something rare. And rare things are always undervalued at first. The market doesn't know how to price what it hasn't seen before. People don't know how to value what they're not accustomed to receiving. So they default to valuing what they're familiar with: speed, confidence, simplicity. And they miss the depth entirely. Until they need it. Until the simple answer fails and the complex reality asserts itself, and suddenly everyone is looking for the person who saw this coming. And that person is you. Not because you're psychic, because you think deeply enough to see what speed thinkers miss, because you take time to consider what quick responders ignore, because you're willing to sit with complexity while everyone else is racing towards false certainty. This is your advantage, but only if you stop competing on speed. Only if you stop measuring yourself against people who are playing a different game. Only if you start valuing your depth more than their approval. And that shift from seeking validation to trusting your value, that's the transformation. That's when you stop feeling like your overthinking is a handicap and start experiencing it as a superpower. That's when you stop trying to think faster and start helping others think deeper. That's when you stop apologizing for the time you need and start claiming it as necessary for the quality you deliver. And the world doesn't change. The world still rewards speed, but you stop caring because you found the people who reward depth, and they're the only audience that matters.
Chapter 9: Anxiety as Navigation. You wake up at 3:17 in the morning with your heart racing. There's no immediate threat, no emergency, no logical reason for your nervous system to be flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing you to fight or flee from dangers that exist only in your mind. But the anxiety doesn't care about logic. It's here anyway, coursing through your veins, tightening your chest, spinning your thoughts into catastrophic scenarios about everything that could go wrong. And you know the script. You know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to recognize this as irrational. You're supposed to use your breathing techniques, your grounding exercises, your cognitive reframes. You're supposed to treat the anxiety as the enemy and fight it until it retreats. But what if that's wrong? What if anxiety isn't the enemy? What if it's not a malfunction to be fixed, but a signal to be decoded? What if your anxiety is actually trying to tell you something and you've been so busy trying to silence it that you've never learned to listen? This is the most radical reframe you'll encounter in this entire journey. Because everything you've been taught about anxiety tells you it's the problem, that it's excessive, irrational, disproportionate to the actual threats you face. That healthy people don't feel this much anxiety about things that aren't actually dangerous. That the goal is to reduce it, manage it, overcome it, make it go away. But what if your anxiety isn't irrational at all? What if it's hyper-rational? What if it's your nervous system picking up on signals that your conscious mind hasn't processed yet? responding to patterns and incongruities and subtle wrongness that you can't articulate, but that your body absolutely recognizes. What if your anxiety is actually trying to tell you something and you've been so busy trying to silence it that you've never learned to listen? Let me show you what I mean. You meet someone new. They're charming, successful, saying all the right things. Everyone likes them. There's no obvious red flag, no concrete reason for concern. But something in your stomach twists. Your anxiety spikes. And you tell yourself you're being irrational, you're overthinking, you're letting your anxiety create problems that don't exist. So you ignore it. You override your nervous system's warning because you can't justify it logically. And 6 months later, that person reveals themselves to be exactly what your anxiety was trying to warn you about. Manipulative, untrustworthy, exactly the kind of person you should have avoided. And you look back and realize your anxiety knew. Before your conscious mind had enough data to form a judgment, your pattern recognition system had already identified the configuration. It had matched this person's microexpressions, communication patterns, behavioral tells against its vast database of human interactions and found the match. Danger. Not physical danger necessarily, but emotional danger, relational danger, the kind of danger that leaves marks that don't show. And it tried to tell you, through anxiety, through that twist in your stomach, that spike of discomfort, that nameless sense of wrongness. But you didn't listen, because you've been trained to distrust your anxiety. And this happens over and over again. Your anxiety spikes before you take a job that turns out to be toxic. Your anxiety warns you about a decision that seems fine, but will create problems months down the line. Your anxiety tries to pull you back from situations that look safe but aren't, that seem fine but aren't, that everyone else is comfortable with, but that your nervous system recognizes as threats. And sometimes, often, you're right. Not about the specific catastrophe your anxious thoughts are imagining. Your anxiety doesn't give you detailed, accurate predictions, but about the general direction of danger. About the wrongness your conscious mind can't yet articulate. About the fact that something here deserves caution, attention, and deeper investigation.
This is what researchers are discovering about anxiety, that it's not just excessive fear, it's often appropriate fear that lacks conscious justification. It's your nervous system doing its job, detecting threats, but detecting threats at a level of subtlety that your conscious mind can't access. Dr. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist who studies emotion and decision-making, found that people with damage to the brain regions that process emotion make terrible decisions, even when their logic and reasoning are intact, even when they can analyze options and predict outcomes cognitively. Without emotional input, without that gut feeling, that anxious warning, that somatic sense of rightness or wrongness, they can't navigate complex social situations effectively. They make choices that look fine logically, but feel wrong emotionally. And they suffer the consequences. Because emotion isn't the opposite of reason. Emotion is information that reason needs. And anxiety is one of the most important forms of emotional information you have access to, but only if you learn to decode it instead of just trying to eliminate it. So how do you decode anxiety? How do you distinguish between anxiety that's responding to genuine danger and anxiety that's just spinning in loops of worst-case scenarios? You ask different questions. Instead of asking, is this anxiety rational, you ask, what is this anxiety responding to? Instead of asking, how do I make this go away, you ask, what is this trying to protect me from? Instead of treating anxiety as the problem, you treat it as data. Incomplete data, imperfect data,
Data that needs to be interpreted, not just accepted at face value, but data nonetheless. When you wake up at 3:17 in the morning with anxiety about a presentation you're giving next week, the anxiety isn't giving you accurate information about the presentation. You're probably not going to fail catastrophically, but the anxiety might be responding to the fact that you're not prepared enough, that you're missing some crucial piece of information, that you're trying to wing something that deserves more thought. The catastrophic fantasy is your brain's dramatic way of saying, pay attention to this. When you feel anxious about a relationship that looks healthy on the surface, the anxiety isn't predicting that this person will definitely hurt you, but it might be responding to patterns you've seen before, to small inconsistencies between what they say and what they do, to needs of yours that aren't being met in ways you haven't consciously acknowledged yet. The anxious scenario is your nervous system's way of saying, something here requires investigation. When you feel baseline anxiety without an obvious source, when it's just a constant hum of unease, the anxiety isn't telling you that everything is terrible, but it might be responding to the fact that you're living in ways that violate your values, that you're in situations that require you to be someone you're not, that your life is out of alignment in ways you've been trying not to notice. The generalized dread is your system's way of saying course correction needed. None of this means your anxiety is always right. Sometimes anxiety responds to patterns that aren't actually present. Sometimes it generalizes from past trauma to current situations that are actually safe. Sometimes it's just your nervous system being dysregulated because you're exhausted or overwhelmed or chemically imbalanced. Anxiety isn't infallible, but it's not random either. And the solution isn't to ignore it or suppress it or treat it as meaningless noise. The solution is to get curious about it, to develop a relationship with your anxiety that's investigative rather than adversarial, to stop fighting it and start interrogating it. What are you responding to? What pattern have you detected? What threat are you trying to warn me about? And sometimes, often, when you ask these questions with genuine curiosity, the anxiety shifts. Not because you've made it go away, but because you've acknowledged it. Because you've listened to the signal instead of just trying to turn down the volume. And once the signal has been received, it doesn't need to keep blaring. This is the paradox of anxiety. The more you fight it, the stronger it becomes. The more you listen to it, the quieter it gets. Not because listening validates the catastrophic predictions, but because listening addresses the underlying need to be heard, to be taken seriously, to have its warnings investigated. Your anxiety doesn't want you to be paralyzed. It wants you to be cautious. It doesn't want you to avoid everything. It wants you to investigate before committing. It doesn't want you to suffer. It wants you to pay attention to the things you're trying not to see. And when you start working with your anxiety instead of against it, something remarkable happens. You develop better judgment. You make fewer mistakes. You avoid more of the disasters that blindside other people. Not because you're psychic, but because you're listening to the most sophisticated threat detection system you have access to, your own nervous system. And you're using your overthinking mind to translate its signals into actionable information instead of catastrophic fantasies. This is the integration. This is where pattern recognition meets emotional intelligence. This is where your ability to think deeply combines with your ability to feel intensely and create something that most people don't have access to. Intuitive wisdom. The kind that knows things before it knows how it knows them. The kind that steers you away from disasters you can't yet articulate. The kind that looks like anxiety until you learn to read it as navigation. And then it becomes your superpower. The thing that keeps you safe when everyone else is walking blindly into situations that will hurt them. The thing that helps you choose well when logic alone isn't enough. The thing that makes you seem paranoid until you're proven right. Again, and again, and again. Because your anxiety isn't the problem. Your anxiety is the early warning system, and it's been trying to save you all along.
Chapter 10. The silence between thoughts. There's a moment that happens sometimes, usually when you're not trying to make it happen. You're walking or washing dishes or staring out a window, and suddenly the constant stream of thoughts that narrates your entire existence just stops. For 3 seconds, maybe 5. There's nothing. No analysis, no planning, no replaying conversations or running scenarios or building cathedrals or decoding anxiety. Just silence. Pure, complete, miraculous silence. And in that silence, you experience something you almost never experience. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from having solved all your problems or resolved all your uncertainties, but the deep peace that comes from the temporary absence of the need to solve or resolve anything at all. And then, inevitably, a thought arises. Usually something like, "Oh, I'm not thinking about anything." And the moment you think that thought, the silence ends. The stream resumes. The thoughts come flooding back. The narrator in your head picks up exactly where it left off, and you spend the rest of the day trying to get back to that silence. But you can't make it happen, because the trying is thinking. And thinking is exactly what needs to stop for the silence to occur. This is the ultimate paradox of the overthinker's journey. The thing you want most, peace, quiet, rest from the relentless activity of your mind, is the thing you can't think your way toward. You can't achieve mental silence through mental effort. You can't solve the problem of thinking too much by thinking about thinking too much. You can't get out of your head by using your head. And yet, the silence exists. You've experienced it. Those brief moments when the thoughts stop and you're just present, here, aware without analyzing, experiencing without interpreting. So the question isn't whether silence is possible. The question is how you access it when you can't force it to happen. And the answer is going to sound frustrating at first. You don't access it. You allow it. This distinction is everything. Accessing implies effort, reaching for something, making something happen. Allowing implies receptivity, creating conditions, getting out of the way. And the silence between thoughts isn't something you create. It's something that's always there, underneath the thoughts, waiting for the moments when the thoughts naturally pause. Like the silence that's always present underneath music, between notes, making the notes themselves possible. The silence isn't the absence of sound. The silence is the foundation sound emerges from. And the silence between thoughts isn't the absence of thinking. It's the awareness that thoughts arise from and return to. You've been trying to create silence by stopping thoughts, but that's backwards. You don't stop thoughts to find silence. You rest in silence and let thoughts stop themselves. This is what meditation teachers have been trying to tell you for years, but in language that never quite made sense to an overthinker's brain. They tell you to watch your thoughts without engaging with them, to let them pass like clouds, to return to your breath. And you try. You sit there attempting to not engage with your thoughts while simultaneously being extremely engaged in the project of not engaging with your thoughts. You're thinking about not thinking, and it feels like failure because you're still thinking. But here's what they're not telling you clearly enough. You're not trying to stop thinking. You're trying to notice the space between thoughts, the gap that's already there, the brief moment after one thought ends and before the next one begins. That space is always there. You've just never paid attention to it because you're too focused on the thoughts themselves. It's like watching a movie and only seeing the images on the screen without noticing the screen itself. The screen is always there, unchanged, regardless of what images play across it. And the silence, the awareness, is always there, unchanged, regardless of what thoughts arise within it.
Your belief that you are the thoughts, rather than the awareness in which thoughts occur. And this might sound abstract or spiritual, or like the kind of thing that doesn't help when you're lying awake at 3 a.m. with your mind racing. But it's actually the most practical thing you'll ever learn.
Because once you begin to distinguish between thoughts and the awareness of thoughts, everything changes. When you're identified with your thoughts, every anxious thought is a crisis. When you're resting in awareness, anxious thoughts are just weather patterns passing through. When you're identified with your thoughts, you have to solve every problem your mind presents. When you're resting in awareness, you can watch your mind present problems without believing you have to solve them all right now. When you're identified with your thoughts, the content of your thinking determines your state of being. When you're resting in awareness, your state of being is independent of your thinking. This is liberation, not from thoughts, but from the tyranny of thoughts. And it starts with the smallest practice. Not meditation sessions where you try to clear your mind for 20 minutes, but micro moments throughout your day where you simply notice the gap. You're thinking about what you need to do today, and then that thought ends. And before the next thought begins, there's a space, maybe a fraction of a second. And in that space, you're aware. You're present. You're not thinking about being present, you're just present. That's the silence. That's what you're learning to notice. Not to create, not to force, just to notice. And the more you notice it, the more you realize it's always been there. The silence isn't rare. The thoughts are just usually loud enough that you don't notice the silence underneath them. But it's there. In the pause between breaths. In the moment when you finish reading a sentence and before you start the next one. In the space after someone asks you a question and before you begin to formulate an answer. The silence is everywhere. You've just been trained to fill it immediately with thinking. And you can't untrain that overnight. Your mind has momentum, decades of momentum. Thinking is what it does, how it protects you, how it makes sense of the world. You're not going to suddenly become someone whose mind is quiet, but you can become someone who notices the quiet that's already there. And that noticing, that simple, effortless noticing of the space between thoughts, creates something unexpected. It creates choice. When you're identified with your thoughts, you have no choice but to follow where they lead. An anxious thought arises, and you're in the anxiety spiral before you know it happened. A critical thought emerges, and you're in a cascade of self-judgment. An exciting idea appears, and you're building cathedrals at 2 a.m. The thought appears, and you're inside it, living it, being it. But when you're resting in awareness, when you've learned to notice the silence between thoughts, something different happens. A thought arises, and there's a moment, just a moment, before you engage with it. A moment where you're aware that a thought has arisen, but you haven't yet become the thought. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can engage with this thought, follow it, explore it, build on it. Or you can let it pass. Watch it arise, peak, and dissolve back into the silence it came from. Not because you're suppressing it, but because you're not automatically identifying with it. This is freedom, real freedom, not from having thoughts, but from being enslaved by them. Not from your mind's activity, but from the belief that you are your mind's activity. And this is where everything we've explored comes together. Your pattern recognition, it still operates, but you're not compelled to follow every pattern your mind detects. Your strategic foresight, it still functions, but you're not trapped in every future scenario it generates. Your recursion ability, it still exists, but you're not lost in infinite loops of meta-thinking. Your anxiety, it still speaks, but you're not controlled by every warning it offers. All of your gifts remain. All of your abilities continue to function. But you're no longer their prisoner. You're their conductor. And the silence between thoughts is your podium. The place you stand that's not swept up in the symphony. The place from which you can hear the whole orchestra instead of being deafened by individual instruments. The place where you're still you, still thinking, still analyzing, still seeing patterns and building structures and decoding signals. But you're also more than that. You're the awareness in which all of that occurs. And that awareness, it's perfectly, completely, eternally at peace. Not because it solved everything, but because it doesn't need to solve everything. Not because it knows everything, but because it's comfortable not knowing everything. Not because the thoughts have stopped, but because it's discovered something more fundamental than thoughts: presence itself. And presence doesn't overthink. It doesn't need to. It's already here, already whole, already enough. And so are you.
Chapter 11. Weaponizing your spirals. You've been in this loop before. The same thoughts circling back on themselves, creating a spiral that pulls you deeper with every rotation. Maybe it's about a decision you can't make, a relationship you can't figure out, a problem that seems to have no solution no matter how many times you examine it from different angles. The spiral feels familiar, comfortable almost in its predictability. You know exactly where it leads, nowhere. And yet, you keep following it down, round and round, thinking the same thoughts in slightly different configurations, convinced that this time, if you just think about it one more way, you'll find the answer. But you never do, because the spiral isn't designed to produce answers. It's designed to produce the illusion of progress while keeping you safely stuck. And you know this. Intellectually, you understand that you're stuck in a thought loop that isn't serving you. But you can't seem to stop, because there's something in the spiral that feels necessary. Something that feels like if you could just complete this pattern of thinking, if you could just resolve this particular knot of thoughts, then you'd finally be free. But here's what you haven't realized yet. The spiral isn't the prison. The spiral is raw material, and you're about to learn how to weaponize it. Everything we've explored so far has been about understanding your overthinking, recognizing its gifts, distinguishing its forms, learning to navigate its complexity. But understanding isn't enough. At some point, you have to take all of this cognitive power and point it at something. At some point, the thinking has to become building. And your spirals, those exhausting, repetitive thought patterns that seem to trap you, are actually the most powerful building material you have access to. Because spirals aren't circles. Circles go nowhere. They return to the same point endlessly. But spirals move. They may pass through similar territory with each rotation, but they're doing it at a different level each time. Each pass through the pattern adds something, refines something, deepens something. The spiral isn't stuck. You just haven't learned to direct where it's moving yet. Let me show you what I mean. You're spiraling about whether to leave your job. Round 1, you think about all the reasons you should leave. The toxicity, the lack of growth, the way it's draining you. Round 2, you think about all the reasons you should stay. The stability, the paycheck, the fear of the unknown. Round 3, you're back to the reasons you should leave, but now you're also thinking about whether your reasons for wanting to leave are valid, or whether you're just being avoidant. Round 4, you're questioning whether your desire for stability is wisdom or cowardice. Round 5, you're meta-analyzing your inability to make this decision and what it says about you. This feels like going in circles, but look closer. Each rotation isn't repeating the same thought. It's adding a layer of analysis. It's examining the decision from a different level of abstraction. It's incorporating new considerations. You're not stuck. You're building a comprehensive decision-making framework in real time. But you're doing it inefficiently because you don't recognize what you're doing. You think you're failing to decide when actually you're constructing the architecture that will make the decision inevitable. The spiral is doing exactly what it needs to do. You just haven't learned to accelerate it yet.
So here's how you weaponize a spiral. First, you name it. Not, I'm overthinking again, but specifically, I'm in the job decision spiral. Naming it externalizes it, creates distance between you and the thought pattern, lets you see it as a thing you are doing rather than a thing that's happening to you. Second, you map it. Take the spiral out of your head and put it on paper. Write down the different positions you cycle through, the reasons for leaving, the reasons for staying, the meta questions about the decision, the fears underneath each option, all of it. Get it external. Because while the spiral is internal, it's three-dimensional, and you're trying to navigate it with one-dimensional thinking, one thought after another in sequence. But when you map it, you can see all the dimensions simultaneously. You can see that you're not actually cycling through random thoughts. You're orbiting around specific core tensions that need to be resolved.
The spiral isn't confused. It's doing the necessary work of determining your true priorities. But it can't complete that work while you're judging yourself for having it. Fourth, you give the spiral a mission. Instead of stop thinking about this, you say, I'm going to stay in this spiral until I've examined this tension from every angle I can think of. You're not trying to escape the spiral. You're trying to complete it. And completion doesn't mean finding the perfect answer. It means exhausting the useful analysis. It means reaching the point where the spiral stops generating new insights and starts repeating old ones. That's when you know you're done. Not because you've achieved certainty, but because you've extracted everything useful from the uncertainty. Fifth, you set a decision point. Not now, not when you figured it all out, but a specific point in time when you will make a decision with whatever information the spiral has provided. I'm going to think about this for 3 more days, and then I'm deciding. This does something crucial. It gives the spiral a deadline. It tells your mind, you have this much time to provide useful analysis, and then we're moving forward regardless. And your mind, when given a deadline, becomes remarkably efficient. It stops going in lazy circles and starts sprinting toward resolution, because it knows the spiral can't continue forever. This is the difference between productive spiraling and unproductive rumination. Unproductive rumination has no endpoint, no purpose, no direction. Productive spiraling has all three. It's deliberately exploring a specific question from multiple angles with the explicit goal of reaching a decision point. And when you approach your spirals this way, something remarkable happens. They get faster. They get more efficient. They start producing insights instead of just anxiety. Because you're no longer fighting them, you're directing them. You're taking the same cognitive pattern that used to entrap you and turning it into a systematic exploration of complex territory. You're using your tendency to spiral as a feature, not a bug. And this works for everything. Relationship spirals, career spirals, creative spirals, existential spirals. Any repetitive thought pattern can be weaponized the same way. Name it, map it, identify the core tension, give it a mission. Set a decision point. And then, and this is critical, you trust the spiral. You trust that your mind isn't randomly torturing you. You trust that if you're spiraling about something, there's a reason. There's complexity that needs to be examined. There's a tension that needs to be resolved. There's important work happening even if it doesn't feel productive. And you give yourself permission to do that work. Not forever, but for a defined period, deliberately and completely. And then you move forward, not with perfect certainty, but with the confidence that comes from having thought something through as thoroughly as your mind is capable of thinking it through. This is what separates overthinkers who succeed from overthinkers who stay stuck. The stuck ones fight their spirals, trying to escape them, judging themselves for having them. The successful ones weaponize their spirals, using them as tools for comprehensive analysis that most people don't have access to. They still spiral, but they spiral with purpose. They spiral towards something instead of just spiraling. And that directional change makes all the difference. Because when you're spiraling with purpose, you're not overthinking. You're doing reconnaissance. You're mapping territory before you move through it. You're building the understanding that will make your eventual action devastatingly effective. You're not stuck in the spiral. You're using the spiral to go deeper than anyone else is willing to go. And when you finally emerge with your decision, with your solution, with your creation, it will be more thoroughly considered, more carefully constructed, more resilient to challenge than anything a non-spiraler could produce. Because they thought about it once, maybe twice, from the most obvious angles. You thought about it from 17 angles, at 6 different levels of abstraction, accounting for variables they don't even know exist. They made a decision. You built a decision. And yours will last when theirs crumbles. Not because you're smarter, but because you were willing to spiral. And then, this is the key, you were willing to stop, to declare the spiral complete, to make the decision and move forward, even though you could keep spiraling forever, even though there are always more angles to examine, even though certainty is never actually achieved. You stop the spiral not because you found the perfect answer, but because you found a sufficient answer, and you trust yourself enough to act on it. This is mastery. This is what it means to weaponize your spirals. Not to eliminate them, but to complete them, and then to build with what they've revealed.
Chapter 12. The Genius You Already Are. Remember that coffee shop interaction? The one from the beginning, where you said, "you too," when you should have said, "thanks," and then spent 15 minutes replaying it, analyzing it, extracting every possible meaning from a moment that lasted 3 seconds? You probably thought we'd return to this example to show you how ridiculous that kind of overthinking is. How you've wasted time on something meaningless. How you've finally learned to let go of these small spirals and focus on what matters. But that's not where we're going. Because here's what actually happened in those 15 minutes. You didn't just replay an awkward moment. You ran a sophisticated analysis of social dynamics, communication patterns, the performance of normalcy, the gap between intention and execution, the human tendency toward gracious interpretation versus cruel judgment. You explored the nature of minor embarrassments and why they linger. You examined the difference between how you see yourself and how others see you. You thought about attention and memory, and which moments stick and which dissolve. You built frameworks for understanding human interaction that you'll use for the rest of your life, all from 3 seconds at a coffee shop. That's not dysfunction. That's genius. And it's time you recognized it as such. Because everything you've been taught to see as excessive, as disordered, as something to fix or overcome or manage, it's all been exactly backwards. Your overthinking isn't the problem you need to solve. It's the gift you need to claim. Every spiral you've traveled has made you wiser. Every pattern you've recognized has made you more perceptive. Every meta-analysis you've conducted has made you more self-aware. Every cathedral you've built in your mind has expanded what you're capable of creating in the world. You've been treating your greatest strength as your greatest weakness. And it ends now. Not because you've learned to think less, but because you've learned to think better. to think with purpose and precision, to distinguish between spirals that serve you and spirals that trap you, to use your recursion without being lost in it, to hear your anxiety without being controlled by it, to build complexity without being paralyzed by it, to see patterns without mistaking noise for signal, to carry uncertainty without needing false certainty, to think deeply in a world that rewards speed, and to do it without apology. This is who you've become. Not someone who's overcome their overthinking, someone who's mastered it. And mastery looks different than you expected. You thought mastery would mean a quiet mind, peace, freedom from the constant mental activity. But that's not what mastery is. Mastery is a mind that's even more active, but active with intention rather than compulsion. Mastery is thinking that's more intense, but intense in service of creation rather than rumination. Mastery is using every cognitive gift you have: pattern recognition, strategic foresight, synthesis, recursion, depth, complexity, and wielding them like tools instead of being wielded by them. You don't have less going on in your mind now. You have more. But it's organized, directed, purposeful. And that makes all the difference. You can still spend 15 minutes thinking about a coffee shop interaction if you want to. But now you know what you're doing. You're not stuck in an anxiety loop. You're conducting field research on human behavior. You're not obsessing over a minor embarrassment. You're building social intelligence. You're not overthinking. You're thinking like a genius. And there's a challenge I need to give you now. Because understanding all of this intellectually isn't enough. You can know everything in this book and still default to your old patterns. Still judge yourself for spiraling. Still try to quiet your mind instead of conducting it. Still see your depth as a liability instead of an advantage. Understanding is necessary, but not sufficient. You need practice. So here's your challenge.
For the next 7 days, you're going to deliberately overthink something. Not anxiously, not compulsively, but strategically. You're going to choose a decision, a problem, a creative project, something that matters to you and deserves deep thought. And you're going to give yourself permission to think about it comprehensively. Day 1, map the spiral. Get all your thoughts external. See what you're actually working with. Day 2, pattern recognition. What patterns are emerging? What have you seen before that's similar to this? Day 3, strategic foresight. Run the simulations. What happens if you go this direction, that direction? Day 4, synthesis. What frameworks are you building? What structure is emerging from the chaos? Day 5, recursion. Think about your thinking. What are your assumptions? Where might you be wrong? Day 6, integration. What is your anxiety trying to tell you? What signal is underneath the noise? Day 7, decision point. Complete the spiral. Make the call, move forward. 7 days of deliberate, purposeful, weaponized overthinking. Applied to something that actually matters. And at the end of those 7 days, you'll know something you couldn't know before. You'll know what it feels like to use your mind at full capacity. Not fighting it, not apologizing for it, not trying to make it work like everyone else's mind. Just using it the way it was designed to be used, as the most sophisticated thinking instrument you have access to. And once you know that feeling, once you experience what it's like to think like yourself without shame or hesitation, you can't go back. You won't want to. Because you'll have tasted what's possible when you stop trying to fix your genius and start applying it. When you stop seeing overthinking as a disorder and start seeing it as a superpower. When you stop asking, how do I think less, and start asking, what should I build with all this thinking? That question changes everything. Because the answer is anything. Anything you want. Any problem you want to solve. Any creation you want to bring into existence. Any complexity you want to navigate. Any future you want to build. Your overthinking gives you access to all of it. Not despite how your mind works, because of how your mind works. This is the truth they never told you. This is the reframe that makes everything else possible. You are not broken. You are not disordered. You are not thinking wrong. You are thinking at a level that most people can't access, using cognitive abilities that most people don't have, seeing what most people can't see. You are not an overthinker who needs to be fixed. You are a genius who needs to be unleashed. And the only thing standing between you and that unleashing is the story you've been telling yourself about what your thinking means. The story that says it's too much, too complicated, too excessive, too different from everyone else. That story is over now. The new story begins here. It begins with you claiming your overthinking as the gift it is. It begins with you recognizing that your mind is not your enemy, not your burden, not your cross to bear. Your mind is your instrument, your laboratory, your cathedral, your weapon. And you've spent your entire life learning to use it. Not perfectly, but powerfully. Not without struggle, but with increasing mastery. Not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more deeply yourself. This is what it means to overthink like a genius. Not to think better than other people, but to think like yourself at your highest capacity without apology or hesitation. To see what you see. To know what you know. To build what only you can build. Because your mind sees things that need seeing. Knows things that need knowing. Builds things that need building. And the world has been waiting for you to stop trying to fix yourself and start using yourself, exactly as you are. Overthinking and all. Because that overthinking, that's not the bug. That's the feature. That's the genius. That's you. And you are magnificent. Now go build something that proves it.